I don't like making predictions for one simple reason. I never get them right and I hate being wrong. But sometimes you've just got to take the risk, don't you? So here's my prediction for today. My prediction is that at the upcoming Watches and Wonders, Breitling is going to release a watch celebrating the 61st anniversary of that watch. You want to know more about what I'm talking about? See me after the intro. Okay, so what watch and why a 61st anniversary? The watch will be the Breitling Cosmonaut. For those of you who aren't aware, a Cosmonaut is a 24-hour dialed version of the Breitling Navitimer. Why the 61st anniversary? Well, that's a bit of a story. It all starts in 1959, 63 years ago, with Lieutenant Commander Scott Carpenter. Lieutenant Commander Carpenter was a member of the Gemini program, one of the first astronauts to go into space, and all of the astronauts get given a job to do on the ground as well as be astronauts and fly the spacecraft. Scott Carpenter's job was to be timing officer. In doing that, he came up with the idea of what they needed was a wristwatch that had added functionality, had a chronograph, had a kind of slide rule mathematical function, but importantly, should also have a 24-hour dial because astronauts in space lose track of AM and PM, but instead need a fixed time in over the 24-hour period. Unfortunately, the idea of a watch is a pretty poor sort of launching pad for an anniversary. Therefore, 1959 isn't really a particularly helpful date to use. So we're not going to talk about this as being a 63rd anniversary, and the gun has definitely not started on the Cosmonaut program as yet. In 1961, Breitling started doing something concrete about that idea, and that's when they introduced the 24-hour dialed version of the Navitimer. This Navitimer came out with the 24-hour dial, but with still the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, the AOPA wings on the dial. It wasn't called a Navitimer yet. It wasn't called a Cosmonaut yet. It was still called the Navitimer, and it was powered by the same Venus caliber 178 with just a gearing change to give you the 24 hours. The name Cosmonaut was registered sometime around June 1961 and started to roll out in the middle half, from the middle and back end of 1961. For me, that is definitely the sound of a gun going off. For me, that means the Breitling Cosmonaut now exists and 2022 is its 61st year. So why didn't we celebrate this last year? Why didn't Breitling do something for the Cosmonaut's 60th anniversary? Because that's a much rounder number and we tend to celebrate round numbers. It's probably because the most important thing about the Cosmonaut doesn't happen in in 1961, happens in 1962. You see, on the 21st of May, 1962, Scott Carpenter gets his own personal Breitling Cosmonaut. What's particularly important about that date, May 21st, is that it is just 3 days before May the 24th when Scott Carpenter strapped himself into a Gemini and went off into space, taking the Breitling Cosmonaut with him. So while strictly speaking, the anniversary of that watch was 61 years ago in 1961, I think that what happened in 60 years ago in 1962 is probably a much bigger event and more deserving of some kind of commemorative version. First question, why now? Why not in May? I think because it's a perfect spike to the Watches and Wonders show. I think dropping something of that kind of significance would, but at the same time not a core model, would actually be, as I said, the perfect kind of scene stealer for Breitling to release before a show that, strictly speaking, they're not really at. Maybe they'll announce it now, but their deliveries will come in May. I don't know, but I think they're going to go ahead with this watch now. Okay, so what's the watch going to look like? I don't think it's going to look much like Breitling did do a 50th anniversary. I don't think it's going to be anything at all like that. That 50th anniversary version was very much more like a contemporary Navitimer, just with a few small mods to make it into a cosmonaut style watch. I think what we're going to get this time is much more along the lines of the 806 revival piece we got a year or two ago from Breitling, much more true to form. I think they're really going to hone in on the things that Scott Carpenter said the watch needed to be different from the normal production Navitimer. Going to Breitling forums and searching through some stories about this, you're able to get I was able to find some actual interviews with Scott Carpenter about this watch. And the easiest thing here is just to quote him when he says, "The Breitling Navitimer required some redesign for spaceflight. For one, the astronauts would not need a tachometer. I had them replace the tachometer with a 24-hour dial. Breitling sent me the redesigned watch called the Cosmonaut 4 days before his flight aboard Aurora 7. It was basically a Navitimer with a circular slide rule." And so that's what I think we're going to get. We're going to get something that looks a lot like that 806 variant that we saw all those years ago. And it's going to have the minimal changes required and the changes that were asked for by Scott Carpenter before he took off. Yeah, so that's it. That's my prediction for Breitling at the watch show they're not going to be at. What do you think? Would you like to see an updated version of the Cosmonaut? Would you rather see one, a sort of a special edition throwback 806 style, or conversely, would you like to see a modern version of the Cosmonaut in the sort of core lineup? Or would you like to see both? I think that's what I'd probably like to see myself, both versions. But yeah, I don't know. I think I wouldn't put my money on getting an updated modern version with a 24-hour dial. I reckon I'd be willing to bet just a tiny bit of my credibility we will get a heritage reissue. I felt like doing something odd, so I've put a little post-credit scene in. In doing the research for this, I came upon a weird little Australian connection in the Navitimer story, in the Cosmonaut story, I was never aware of. When researching this and reading the interviews with Scott Carpenter, he explains where the idea of a Navitimer came from at all. Turns out that in preparation for the Gemini missions, he spent some time in Australia working with Australian fighter pilots over in Western Australia. During that time, he noticed that the Australian pilots were many of them were using Breitling Navitimers. And he really liked the way that they were laid out. He really liked the slide rule functionality, and he thought it would be perfect for some sort of space traveling watch. And so, yeah, it came as a nice little surprise to me to find that not only is there an Australian, but an Australian Air Force connection around Breitling, the space program, and the creation of the Cosmonaut. I only found this out as I was getting this video together, so it certainly wasn't part of my little fanboyism of Breitling now, but certainly does add to that.